That's a much different seat than you've had recently, isn't it? Look at you getting spoiled. Come on, Speedster.
Where are you going? Hey, you.
Some dogs up there barking at him. I think he's gonna work his way over to them up there. We'll see. Well, good day, my friends. You can see a friendly face beside me. She had a few days off and came out to join me. So we are exploring the St. Paul, Minnesota area this time, and we both love wrestling, and there is a wrestling legend. I mean, when you think of Minnesota wrestling, I mean, you kind of think of VERNE GAGNE, but we found out that there's a really, really crazy thing that happened when he had Alzheimer's. He was accused of homicide. We're going to talk about his amazing career and then the crazy ending of his life today. Daze with Jordan the Lion and Katie begins now. He's making a friend over there. We're giving him a chance to make some friends and run or whatever he wants to do. And then we're going to head over and visit Vern. Oh, my mistake. It's actually closer to the Medina area, not St. Paul. I think it's actually right over here. So in the town of Hamel, we're at St. Anne's Church, and they have a small cemetery, and that's where VERNE GAGNE, 10-time world champion, is laid to rest. Katie's over there looking around. There's a couple of Gagnes over there. There's a Gagne right here. It's a very small cemetery. So here is the grave. Looks like Clarence over there, then Wilfred, and Vern. Now Vern was a college champion, wrestled in the Olympics, I think it was the 1948 Olympics, and then became a professional wrestler. He was a good-looking guy, he was a very good technical wrestler, and he wanted to be champ. And at the time, the National Wrestling Alliance was kind of the governing body of most of the US territories of wrestling, and no matter how close he got, had championship matches, he never got his chance to be the champion. So he ended up buying in to his own organization. He bought into the AWA, and when the AWA, he actually first bought in and was still wrestling for NWA and had one last match where he didn't get the title. So the AWA decided to form its own championship, and you would think he would make himself the first champion, but he didn't. What he did was, the man that he could never beat, Pat O'Connor, who was the NWA champion, they named him the AWA champion and said if he didn't come and defend the title within 90 days that he would lose and vacate the championship. And since he was under contract elsewhere, that's exactly what happened. So Vern got the first championship by it looking like his competitor was afraid to show up and just vacated the title to him. Now he ended up really only trusting himself. He would lose the title occasionally, but he really, if he did, it was for short amounts of time, and it was only to people that he really trusted, like Mad Dog Vachon or Dick the Bruiser, or, you know, somebody like that, Fritz Von Erich, somebody who owned an organization that he could trust that he would get his belt back. And he ended up basically being responsible for making AWA one of the biggest, if not the biggest, wrestling organization of its time.
Gagne has worked Fez over unmercifully with this headlock. Look out. Oh, look at that. He is out like a light. There goes. You're going to have to get him out of here, Vern.
So originally when it started, Vern's territory was Wisconsin, Minnesota primarily, and Nebraska, but then he extended it over to Denver, Salt Lake City, Phoenix, and San Francisco. So he had a lot of big markets, and therefore he was actually drawing big crowds. He was getting like $16,000, $20,000 or 20,000 people showing up for these and getting pretty big gates for it. Now therein was one of the problems. Verne was known historically as not being liked by the people that wrestled for him. He apparently would cheat people out of money. A lot of the wrestlers would say they were promised or expected certain gates from the box office, and when it came time to being paid, they got shortchanged or ripped off, or they would have a bigger gate than expected and they would get less than they thought. Verne didn't like to drop the title, and that was a problem, but he recognized good talent and would bring in good talent. So he sought out wrestlers through training them himself, and he had this really famous farm that he ended up training some of the most famous names in wrestling history. One of the things about it though was that Verne, he only wanted people that had a background similar to him, somebody who was really well trained, that was a champion, somebody that had a college background or really good high school background, and those were the people he ended up training. He trained Ken Patera, Khosrow, who became the Iron Sheik. He trained Ric Flair, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, eventually Kurt Hennig, and would end up bringing these people into the business. So one of the biggest things that he did, other than just, bringing in new talent, was that Hulk Hogan came to him, and he hired Hulk Hogan because Hulk had been with the WWF and Vince McMahon Sr., but Vince didn't want him to do Rocky. And he wanted to do Rocky, so he did Rocky, got fired, and then went over to Japan and was making a pretty good living in Japan. And then AWA ended up hiring him, and he was supposed to be a heel, came in as a heel, and then people loved him so much that Hulk was making a ton of money just selling the shirts that he was making at the local mall, the Hulkamania shirts. And he went off to Japan, took a good deal to wrestle over there, but the Japanese competitor had a deal with AWA, and since Hulk had signed his own deal there, he couldn't do the shows that AWA wanted, so they got mad at him for that. And when he came back, he found out that Verne was selling his Hulkamania shirts and making money off of them without him, and Hulk didn't like that either. So then, of course, at this time, Hulk was not champion, and everybody thought he should have been champion. It would have been probably better for the business for him to be champion, but Verne didn't feel that he had the qualifications. Hulk was not a traditional wrestler. He couldn't do the moves and things that all the other guys that he thought should be champion could do. And so he had 2 title matches that Hulk ended up winning the title, but the first one, within a week, he was stripped of it and said that he was disqualified by using a foreign object. And then in the second one, he was disqualified within seconds of winning the title by them saying he threw Nick Bockwinkel over the top rope. So Hulk ended up getting a very lucrative offer from Vince McMahon Sr., who had bought up the California territory and was starting to kind of horn in on the other territories that were in trouble. And Hulk went off with him, Mean Gene went off with him, and Vince was signing all of the big talent, while Verne refused to change, refused to adapt to the times, didn't want to do the gimmicks, didn't want to do that kind of stuff. And with people just feeling like they weren't making money and that the business wasn't progressing, people started to leave Verne. And so a man who created an organization in 1960, by 1985 would see most of his big talent leaving. He would continue to keep it going for another 5 years, but really he was just creating new talent like the Rockers and Kurt Hennig, who would become Mr. Perfect, and people like that, Rick Martel, to be his champions, and then they would just take off to WWF at the time and become big stars over there, till Verne finally had to close his own doors. And you know what's sad is that he pulled Eric Bischoff out of like an office boy position and gave him a job commentating with a microphone with Verne, in the AWA, and apparently Verne was so disliked that when Eric Bischoff had a chance that he could have hired Verne for WCW, he wouldn't do it. Now let me tell you the crazy thing that Verne was accused of. So I was really shocked. I had never heard this until I was reading up to do this vlog. I've known, you know, I've read up on the AWA history for so long, but not Verne's personal history. Now, that farm that he owned, he was using that to leverage the organization, his wrestling organization. That was kind of what was keeping it afloat, and eventually eminent domain took it away, and he kept using his money to fight it and eventually lost it. So that camp and that farm and everything is gone. But Verne ended up getting Alzheimer's, and he ended up going into a home. And I had read an article that they said that he had, while being in the home, had body slammed a 98-year-old outside of his room, and the man had suffered a broken hip and a fractured skull and had been in the hospital, and then had been released, and then ended up back in the hospital and died. And apparently they were going to charge Verne with this. Now, Verne apparently way far gone with Alzheimer's, and the family of the man who ended up the victim of this, the 98-year-old, said that even though they knew that Verne was responsible, they didn't want to charge him because they said he didn't know what he was doing. And I was reading separate articles about this, and they all kind of seem to have that take on it. And you would think if that was what happened, that the police would have seen that there was evidence of a body slam. There was even reports from the facility that Verne had punched the guy in a separate incident before. Apparently, just while Verne was suffering with Alzheimer's, he just didn't know he wasn't a wrestler. And after this, after the man passed away, I read that Verne was asked to leave the facility. Now, I had found an interview today with Larry Zbyszko, who was one of the last champions for AWA, and he was Verne's son-in-law, and he says that's not what happened. He believes, and he said this is the real story, according to Larry Zbyszko, is that Verne's wife Mary was taking care of Verne in the basement of their home for as long as she could, but apparently Verne got so bad that he was at like 3 or 4 in the morning, was walking out of the house naked and was walking around the neighborhood. And I've known people that had Alzheimer's, and that is definitely the case, that they will just walk away from a place and start walking miles down the road until someone stops them or whatever. So that was happening, and so they put him in this facility, and Larry said the Verne was so weak, he had to have help getting up and out of the chair, and that the real story, he said, was that this man that ended up falling just simply did that. He was walking by the room with a walker and fell and hurt himself, and then it got blown out of proportion, and that the media blamed Verne for this. But that is a very weird thing to think about. Katie and I were talking about this, like, what happens in a case like that? Someone is suffering from Alzheimer's or dementia, and they do something like this. What is the moral thing as far as charging someone, or what happens when you have put them in the facility to be cared for because you can't care for them yourself? It's just a really sad ending to a man who was the AWA World Champion 10 times.
His own family even said in that article that he didn't even know who he was.
Yeah, he said Larry Zbyszko said Verne didn't know who he was and didn't even know he was in the facility while he was in there. Guy was a phenomenal Hall of Famer, phenomenal entertainer, and really the wrestling business, we wouldn't have Hulkamania, we wouldn't have Ric Flair, we wouldn't have the Iron Sheik. Crazy story about the Iron Sheik. When Hulkamania was about to be birthed, the Iron Sheik was supposed to drop the title to Hulk Hogan, and it's widely reported that Verne, and Iron Sheik has confirmed it, Verne offered the Sheik $100,000 to break, maybe it was even more, maybe it was $500,000, to break Hulk Hogan's leg permanently so he couldn't wrestle again. And the Sheik refused to do it. So it's kind of sad that a man who had such a great history, a 30-year business career, put on a lot of shows, that in the end kind of his own stubbornness and ego got in his way and left people with kind of a somewhat a bad taste in their mouth about his legacy. But no doubt he is a legend and a Hall of Famer. Kind of wondering if his son Greg, who is also a wrestler, will be buried right here next to him, because this whole section over here is all Gagnes. And Verne was a legit tough guy. I mean, it wasn't just like a good wrestler. He was a tough guy. If he had altercations with other wrestlers, he did not hesitate. Many stories of him getting into physical fights with guys over arguments. It was said that when Verne wanted Stan Hansen to drop the title, Stan was so mad that he took the belt out and ran over it back and forth with his truck and gave it back to Verne with muddy tire prints across it. Verne was actually champion at one point for 7 years straight. I honestly do wonder, like, what would the courts, how would the courts decide something like that if a 90-year-old man who was a former wrestler was accused of body slamming a 98-year-old. They both have Alzheimer's in an Alzheimer's facility, and the 98-year-old passes away. Certainly it would be a crime, but I mean, how would they treat that, I wonder? We have arrived at Friendship Village. So unfortunately, this is where that incident happened. Now, I know Larry Zbyszko says that that didn't happen, and he also says that the guy died months and months later, but that's just not true. The coroner's report even said that that Verne had slammed the victim, and there was actually a statement given by the victim's family that said Verne Gagne shouldn't be held responsible for his role in my dad's death because he has Alzheimer's disease. Therefore, I don't believe the police should press criminal charges against him. So the coroner, the police, everybody said that it did happen. I think I said Verne was 90 at the time, but I'm reading in the incident report that he was 82. So wherever that was said, I don't know if Larry Zbyszko said he was 90 at the time, but it was actually 82. When I say we wouldn't have had a Ric Flair without Verne, I really meant that. Rick signed up with Ken Patera to do Verne's camp and then quit after the first day or first couple days and went home, and Verne showed up at his house, pulled him right out of the front door, threw him on the front lawn, said, "You're not quitting." Said, "You're gonna have to fight me to quit." Said, "You've quit everything in your life, you're not quitting this." All right, Katie, I know I'm a nerd, but are you as excited to see this place knowing the history of what we're gonna talk about here as I am?
Yeah, it's amazing that this is what it's turned out to be after all these years.
I actually found Hulk Hogan in an interview mentioning the Yorktown Mall by name. Here at the Yorktown Mall, you know, I think one of the first, or like one of the biggest signs of Hulkamania when you would see Hulk is he would come from the back and tear that Hulkamania shirt right off his chest, right, Katie?
Yeah, that's right.
So he said it was right here at the Yorktown Mall behind us. We don't know exactly which store, but he said at a little t-shirt shop here, he would have the original Hulkamania shirts that he would wear and that he would sell at the wrestling events. And he said he was making more money off the shirts than really anything at that time. So when Verne demanded half the money or was selling his shirts without his permission, he said that was his surefire sign, "I'm out of here. If you're ripping me off for my t-shirt money, then I'm out of here." Like half the shops here are out of business anyway. I would love to know which one he had make his shirts. This place doesn't even know. They should have a freaking statue of Hulk Hogan here right in front of Joann's Fabrics. One more stop today. So now we're over at the Mall of America, and the reason I'm here is because this used to be the Met Stadium. The Twins used to play, but when Verne founded the AWA 1960, some of his biggest times were at the Met here. Had in 1961, 8,000 spectators came to see Verne beat Gene Kiniski. 1964, 11,000 spectators came to see Verne Gagne beat Dick the Bruiser in 3 falls. And they continued having matches here for many, many years. No mention of the AWA inside the Mall of America, but if you wander around through the amusement park area, they actually do have plaques to the Minnesota Twins and some of the historic moments that happened for the Twins here, so that's kind of cool. All right, my friends, we're gonna call it a day. I know this was kind of a crazier tribute to VERNE GAGNE than I normally do, but wow, what a big story for such a big man. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you all next time. Have a great night and goodbye.